So welcome everybody. This is the introduction to machine learning, and the guy who's doing all the important stuff, namely recording things, is Geoff Gordon. So he's my co-lecturer, and I'm Alex Smola. Just to make sure there's no confusion, this is Geoff, this is me. I'm mentioning this because apparently last semester we had somebody at lecture number 5 asking, are you Barnabas or are you Alex? When I was teaching with Barnabas Pochos. He's, of course, much younger and more handsome, but yeah, for whatever reason, somebody confused it. So if you need our email addresses, Google them, and you will find them. I think you made your way here, so you'll be able to do this. OK. There'll be more stuff on this website later in the next few days. Don't worry. The slides for today are already up. But usually, there will be an updated version of the slides on that website within a day or two. So make sure you download the latest version, because Geoff and I like to sneakily insert errors such that you pay attention. Well, you could also say, well, we make errors and we didn't notice it. And then sometimes we'll horribly notice during the lecture, and we'll fix it later on. So a little bit of administrative stuff. So the lectures are Monday and Wednesday, 10:30 to 11:50 in Wien Hall 7500. The recitations are 5 to 6:30 in the same place. I guess nobody needs to know where Wien Hall 7500 is, because you all found your way here. So it's no big deal. So office hours, in my case, they are from 1 to 3 on Mondays. Why not from 12 to 2? Because I would like to have a little bit of lunch. That's the only reason. So basically after the class for 2 hours. And the TAs will also probably have some times when they will be available. All this information will be up online. Yes?
What's covered in the recitation?
So what's covered in the recitation will be 2 things. First of all, some background material that you should really know, but maybe for one reason or another, you may not have taken that class, or maybe the lecturer who you took it from didn't cover it, or whatever. So there will be linear algebra, optimization, various other things. The recitations will also go in depth on some subjects that maybe didn't get covered entirely in class. They'll also cover things like, for instance, homeworks to some extent. You know, it'll be on demand and on need based on whatever helps you guys the most. So in other words, if there's something that you're feeling lost at, don't be shy letting us know. Mind you, for that, there's also a Google group. And, well, you know, sign up there. We'll add you probably within 24 hours or so. You'll be on that group. You just need to actually go there. And the homepage for the class, as I already mentioned, is there. If you go to my homepage, you'll find a link to right from there. Overall, this class is obviously for you guys. So Geoff and I hopefully know what we are talking about. At least we'll pretend to. So what this means is, if there are any questions, you need to ask, right? So if something's not clear, raise your hands. We can cover more material faster, or we can go through stuff more slowly and more in depth. The choice of what we're going to do here is very much a function of what helps you the most. So we'll slow down if this is where you will get the most mileage out of it. But for that, I need your feedback. So who's taken a machine learning class before? OK, good. So that's about maybe 10% of the audience. OK, who's heard of dynamic programming? Awesome. You'll need it a lot. That'll be fun. And thanks for the response. This is good. So at least it means you guys are awake. So a couple of other things in terms of, you know, grading policy and so on. So we'll have 3 components to how you get your grades. First component is, and that's actually in a way the most fun and most important one, is the project. And that covers 1/3 plus epsilon of your score. Then there's the midterm exam, and there's the homework. So you might wonder, well, why no final? Well, because it's really cruel on you guys to have to present, you know, a really good final project. and then prepare for the final. And then we also have the issue, well, you know, what should we cover in the final? Should we cover everything or just the last bit and so on? So this way you'll have a little bit more freedom to deliver a really awesome project. Not having a final doesn't mean that you should slack off after the midterm, right? So I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, you're going to learn stuff. So if you want to slack off, well, I mean, I can't really stop you. But if you want to learn stuff, I think it's in your interest to not do this. And then there's the homework. And just to keep things really simple, what we said is, you know, it's the best n-1 out of n homeworks. So what that means is that if you have to you know, meet some urgent appointment in the Bahamas once, well, OK, sure, go for it. But if you need to do that more than once, it's not so great, right? Alternatively, if you diligently submit all the homeworks and get full marks for the first n-1 times, well, you can probably slack off the last time. So, and there'll be details on the submissions mechanism and so on coming up shortly. So Geoff is preparing something really awesome for that. Homepage will contain links to videos, problems, slides, other stuff. And also, I mean, the news groups are for you guys, and if you find something useful, post it there. That's fine. Last thing about the project. So one thing that I found last semester is that some students came and said, well, you know, basically, they came to me like 2 weeks before the end of the project and asked me whether this was a good project, or, you know, they changed the project many times and their teams changed a lot and they pivoted a lot. And that's maybe not optimal. So what I would very much like you to do is to start looking around who you want to work on a project with. And it's probably a good idea to start with a team that's of size 4, because sometimes people will bail out and they will not really follow through on the course, or they will not do the project or whatever. So, you know, there's strength in numbers. And you'll be all scored in the same way. But basically, come to me or Geoff, or talk at least to the TAs, as to whether that project's a good idea. And we probably have a couple of ideas for cool projects. We might even have some gadgets. So I don't know yet, but I might have some accelerometer recording devices in a week's time, which might be a really good thing to play with if you want to work on graphical models and HMMs and so on. So we might have resources. We might have devices. We basically might have a lot of fun things for you to work on for a project. And we can probably help you work on something that's A, manageable, and B, might actually be something that maybe later on you can actually turn into some publication of some form. OK. So talk to us. We're a resource. Because quite often what I see is that in the first week or two, nobody really shows up in the office hours. Start showing up early. You know. OK, good. So homework, don't copy. I mean, you're stupid if you copy because you don't learn anything. And after all, I mean, you're doing a PhD to learn stuff. Teamwork's OK. So you will probably learn something from discussing with some of your fellow students. OK. So one last thing, which is the wait list, right? Because I think a lot of you are currently on the wait list. Who is on the wait list right now? Wow. OK. Fear not. Because what will probably happen, as in what will certainly happen, is that there will be enough people bailing out that the numbers just fit.
We'll do our best by giving pop quizzes in the first few days to make people drop.
Yeah. Yes?
I think the last add drop day is today. Is there some kind of exception for this course?
No. So what happens is you stay on the wait list. Obviously, I cannot guarantee that you will actually get in. I cannot guarantee it. I cannot legally guarantee it. However, people will drop out over time. Well, if that doesn't happen, if the room is too full, we'll make sure it happens. But usually, we don't have to try too hard. So we'll make it fit. But What it means more specifically is if you really want to take the course and the first homework comes around and you're still on the wait list, just do the homework and submit or email it as if you were doing it regularly, and it'll get graded as soon as you're on the list. So this way you don't lose out on the homework. But obviously I cannot guarantee it because there are limits that are being set which are, it's not under my control. Yeah. Okay, so that's about that. So color coding, on my slides at least, and I don't know what Geoff is going to do, but the really important stuff is green. The important stuff is yellow, and the regular stuff is red. Well, you might wonder why red. Well, because it's the standard CMU tartan red color, so I just went with that color scheme. Yes. Tell us if you have any concerns, questions, anything whatsoever. If there's like even a topic that you really, really, really would want to have covered. So feedback is good. Constructive feedback, early feedback is better, right? So don't wait until 5, 6 lectures into the class and then you say, oh my God, this class sucks because it's way too fast and I'm completely lost. This is the wrong time to complain, right? Or this class is terribly boring, you're going way too slowly, I want to have something more fun. Well, we may not be able to cater for that, but we may at least be able to point you to some papers that you can read instead or some other things that you can do. So don't worry. Okay. So what we'll be doing by and large is, well, we'll go through some basic tools, some standard algorithms that you would see more or less eventually, so decision trees, nearest neighbors, maybe neural networks, definitely the perceptron naive Bayes. We'll talk about linear models. We'll look a little bit at theoretical tools, probably a bit less than in the previous class. We'll definitely talk a fair amount about probabilistic methods, how to actually capture, if you have several random variables, how they interact. Depending on how we go, we'll look at how you interact with the environment. So for instance, if you think about all the recommender systems, so who's bought something on Amazon or watched Netflix or Hulu recently? Probably a lot of us have. These are essentially running such algorithms somewhere in the back. And if we get to it, we'll talk a little bit about scalability. So this is sort of a sketch of an outline, the point being that the amount of content that we'll cover will be very much a function of how much in depth you want us to go and how many, and which things you really care about having covered. Okay. So why do you care? Well, for a couple of obvious reasons. Well, for your PhD, because you need to tick that box off, but maybe you might want to do a startup. So I can safely assure you that what you'll be learning in this class is more than what the average machine learning based startup engineers do when they do their startup. As in, I know that because I've gotten a lot of questions from a lot of startups. And these are smart folks, but you'll be better trained than them if you do a startup after this. And yeah, of course, you can go to Wall Street, unfortunately, or do something more useful. So yeah, if you go to Wall Street, sponsor a professorship at some point. OK, so what do we really do? So programming with data, that's in a way the metaphor that you might want to think of in terms for machine learning. So I mean, the earliest where I've seen that metaphor expressed was actually by the late Sam Rovais. And essentially the idea is, well, if you want to solve a problem, you could either write a really complicated program, or you could just feed it a lot of examples of what's happening, and then eventually you'll get somewhere. So here's an example of collaborative filtering. Actually, it's an example of collaborative filtering gone badly wrong. These are movie recommendations that came up on Netflix. I think it probably wouldn't happen now anymore. But what you can clearly see is what happened here is that several movies like kids movies and other things were all mixed up, and so you get some very horrible recommendations that nobody in the family would want to watch. Netflix actually addressed this by now by having sub-accounts. Amazon Books, well, this is actually a much better recommendation. So as a matter of fact, all those books I have on my wall, and Amazon just so happened to even recommend me those after I bought them, obviously, but at least it's quite a good recommendation. So here's another one. Imitation learning in games. You probably don't remember this game, Black and White, which was kind of a cool game. At least the idea was very cool. So you had an avatar, and you could train this up, and you would play God. So these are always fun games, right? And the avatar would eventually, start mimicking what you do. This is one of the first applications of machine learning in games. And while this is kind of awesome, this is also what killed the game. Because what happened is that they tried to have a perceptron, which would then try to infer, based on your behavior, what the appropriate action for the avatar is. And unfortunately, the guy who implemented it did not regularize the perceptron. So it started overfitting, because, of course, as a player, you're not entirely consistent in the space of linear attributes that, the guy who wrote this did. So in other words, controlling your avatar became insanely brittle, and the avatar would start behaving in very erratic ways as you went through. And that's what stopped making the game play a lot of fun, and they lost a lot of money. So the point is, it was an awesome idea, and because they didn't know probably the stuff that you would learn in the first 2-3 classes of machine learning, well, they lost many millions of dollars. Okay. By now they know. No, actually, the guy who did it knows by now. So this is another example. So this is probably a little bit dated, but in the Xbox, I don't know whether Forza still exists, but essentially the drivatars where it would try to learn by imitating your driving behavior. It was also trained by using machine learning, by essentially, trying to, well, when you bump into a wall, it'll do that too. And so you can have then the drivatars race against each other on the Microsoft servers, and this way you can say, hey, I'm faster than you, even though we never played against each other, which, it's kind of cute. The probably more fun thing in this context is quick match, or it's a true skill. So this is essentially, well, if you play Halo and you play against the guy who's just really good and who does nothing else than playing Halo, it's not very much fun for you because you'll just get shot up every 5 seconds. On the other hand, if you play against somebody who doesn't know how to hold a gun, well, it's not fun either because you'll kill him every 5 seconds. So the point, therefore, is you want to really team up players who have comparable skills. And this, again, turns out to be a machine learning problem because you want to essentially infer the relative abilities and scores of individual players or of entire teams together. And this is arguably one of the reasons why the Xbox Online component is actually fairly effective. So the other thing that you've probably seen at some point is spam filtering. And so if you click on the spam or the ham part of the mailbox, well, you'll see the right things happening or not. And a recommendation, if you don't like spam, label the emails that you receive as spam. This will benefit not just everybody, but it might also benefit you in particular, especially if you have a model that's trained to a specific user. Okay. Here's another example of where you can actually use machine learning. So the reason why I'm showing you this is because machine learning is actually so many different things. And OK, so this is stuff that at least about 1.5 years ago was deployed at Yahoo. I don't know what they did since. But when we built it, this ran on essentially 1 billion user accounts. And what you see in the curves are basically interests of users over time. This is all automatically determined. We didn't tell or teach the computer in any way what it means that there's a dating topic or a baseball celebrity or whatever. But you can actually extract interesting stories out of this. If you look at the left curve, well, this guy is clearly interested in dating. After about a week, he realizes maybe something's wrong with his health, and dating takes a dive, or maybe somebody told him that he or she is maybe slightly heavier than he should be, and then he takes a liking in baseball, and at that point, dating takes a further dive. The other guy was never terribly much interested in that at all, diehard baseball fan, but after about 4 or 5 days, he starts worrying about not having enough money to afford his hobby, and then starts looking for a job about a week later. So why do you care about stuff like this? Because, well, if I know what you're interested in, I can target ads in a meaningful way to you. Now, yes, of course, ads are evil, but the problem is you either have to pay expensive subscriptions because somebody has to pay for the servers, or you see the ads. Now, if you have to watch ads, at least you want to have ads that are meaningful to you. I mean, nothing's more aggravating than an ad of something that you really would never even consider looking at. Here's another example. This is by now pretty much deployed worldwide. This is essentially check reading. So what happens is that, well, I guess by now most banking apps, where you can, rather than taking the check to the bank, which takes you time, you can just snap a picture and it gets uploaded and parsed, and it'll do something interesting. And what this does, what this requires actually is that you segment the image, you find out which money goes where onto which account, and you need to do optical character recognition. And this is non-trivial because different checks look very differently. So you need to have both a segmenter, you need to find out which parts are meaningful for what. You need to then parse, recognize handwritten characters, you need to parse the standard writing. Just a very counterintuitive thing. It turns out that corporate checks which are machine printed are harder to parse than handwritten checks. That has a lot to do with them being a lot more creative about the layout. At least that's what it was in '95 when AT&T was building such a system. So you can do something else, and you should now see the autonomous helicopter. So this is courtesy of Andrew Ng. And yes, this is all automatically controlled. So what they did is they had somebody actually fly this thing before, and they learned the controller for it, and then they basically managed to just re-implement it by essentially learning the controller. And I mean, you can take this further. I mean, Peter Abel has done great work on this since. So this is another example where you can do really interesting things with machine learning. Image layout. So this is an example where, so these are actually holiday pictures that I took a long time ago, and we used a fairly straightforward layout algorithm to make sure that similar images, so this is actually from 2 different cameras taken over a period of about a week, and you can argue that without using any of the EXIF data or GPS, which at the time wasn't really very much there yet, you get very similar images laid out in the same spot, which is kind of useful if you go on a road trip and you see a spot and you take a picture and you come back maybe after a week and you take another picture. It'll actually put them closely together, as they should. So again, this is machine learning, in this case, just maximizing the correlation between the layout grid and basically the information in the images. And you could do a lot more interesting things than the primitive color histograms that we used there. Then, of course, ads. So if you want to work at Google in Pittsburgh, you would be almost certainly working on something ad-related. They have a really, really nice setup there. It's actually a very awesome team. But so, by the way, you might wonder, why do you see so many ads if you search for mesothelioma? These are some of the most expensive ads you can think of. So a conversion on a mesothelioma ad, and the numbers are dated and so on, and I think I can obscure them sufficiently, at some search engine, not necessarily Google, but some search engine, run in the order of maybe $100 for a single ad conversion. So if you hate your friendly lawyer, sign up. Yeah, no, don't do it. I mean, but basically, some of the ads monetize very, very well, just because class action lawsuits. And if you look at which ads are the most monetizing one by country, you get all the wonderful stereotypes that you ever knew about countries. It's quite bad. But I don't know whether these are published results. But basically, think of any stereotype. You'll see it exactly in the ads. So here's another example of why you want to learn machine learning. So this is a true startup story of a company that was afterwards bought by Yahoo, and then they turned it into about $1 billion business. So the startup builds, in this case, well, let's say some ad exchange for web pages. And the clients bid an opportunity, so the market takes a cut. So this is the usual setup. And, well, people start using it. So then they realize, well, actually, this thing works better if they add a couple of choice rules, like, well, maybe the web pages with kittens on it shouldn't really suggest unsound financial advice, or maybe they should. But so anyway, the programmer adds a couple of if-then-else clauses, and things get better, and they make more money. Then they add more clauses, and it gets even more better, right? And at some point, they realize that a system with many, many, many if-then-else clauses, well, this has a name. It's called a decision tree. So the guy downloads the first decision tree package that he can find, implements it, the system gets even better. And then at some point, that decision tree gets a mess, and they reach the limit, and they read about boosting, and they implement boosting. And OK, then the system gets bought, and then maybe the machine learning system is replaced entirely by something else. I've seen this happen more than once. It's probably not a bad thing if you don't have to learn all those steps the hard way, which is exactly why you learn machine learning now, and then you maybe use it in some larger case. And you would not believe how many times there's still very low-hanging fruit, essentially in areas where right now a lot of things are hand-tuned, where there are explicit rules. By switching them to something that's adaptive, you will be able to have significant impact. So I've seen a lot of really good work overall in science happening by somebody taking a fairly well-established technique and applying it in some completely different context where people hadn't thought of it yet. I've seen many best paper awards happening this way. So this is not a bad thing, because it's very, very rare that you'll come up with a genuinely new idea that nobody else before you had. I mean, even if you take something like special relativity, right? Well, all the algebra, the Lorentz transforms, are due to Lorentz, who did this before Einstein, right? Einstein then had the ingenious understanding of why this actually had to make sense. But the algebra was there already before. That's why they're called the Lorentz transforms. So basically, don't feel bad about taking a well-established idea and applying it somewhere else where it hasn't been applied yet. You can do a lot of good. Okay. So what we want, and this is essentially why you would want to do programming with data, you want to have something that's robust and fault-tolerant, where you don't really have to write up each and every if-then-else rule, because that gets complicated real fast. It's also quite brittle, and it's essentially a nightmare to maintain. So this thing still happens a lot. For instance, something that we ran into recently is ontologies. So when you go and browse through the purchase, let's say you want to buy something on Amazon, then you go through the entire ontology of where you find stuff. And you'll run into bizarre cases like, well, where do the memory cards go? Do you put the SD cards on the computers, or do you put them on the cameras, or maybe there's a lot of other devices that need them too, so where do you put them, right? And for instance, one case that we had was that the ontology that we worked with, and this is like very recent, like 2-3 weeks ago, it put hardware into one box and software into another one. And you can already see where this is going wrong, because if I put the game consoles into one category and then the software that goes with them into the other one, you end up getting recommendations for, let's say, Microsoft Forza if you have a PS3. And that does not work very well. So once you then actually go and use the machine learned hierarchy, it immediately did the following thing, that it put all the Xbox stuff into one category and all the PS3 into another one, and so on and so on. So quite often, you will actually be able to beat human performance without actually having to pay humans to generate the data for you. And on top of that, it will still be meaningful for people to go through. OK. So the standard procedure is either you have some data and some outcome that you want to predict. And that's typically what's called supervised learning. So if you have X and Y pairs, it's usually supervised. If you only have X's, where you then want to find some structure, that's usually called unsupervised. And this is like a super coarse, high-level description. But it might help you a little bit figure out if you have a specific problem to solve what you're really trying to do. The other warning, of course, or heads up, or whatever you might want to call it, is the problem that you're going to try and solve specifically in practice will almost certainly not be a perfect fit for any of those categories that you will learn in this class. Right? This is why you need to be able to understand the algorithms, because you will have to modify them at least slightly to make them really fit well. So it's just like when you buy a pair of pants, maybe the length isn't quite right. So but I mean, more bluntly, I've seen people fail to really get much benefit from their algorithms by not understanding that they have to modify them slightly for the specific problems. So this is probably the one thing where you can really, get more skill and expertise trained by, trying to figure out how some problems that you might encounter can be cast as estimation problems, what the basic prototypes are in it, and then, this will actually make you a better scientist. By the way, any questions at any time, go and ask. I know this is going fairly slow right now, because I want to make sure that we all at least have the common currency of what we think about and talk about when we talk about machine learning. There'll be more math as we go along. Don't worry, there'll be plenty of math.
Earlier when you were explaining what went wrong with the game, you said something about regularizing a perceptron.
Correct.
Can you define those terms?
OK, thanks. Awesome question. So regularization means that you want to make sure your model cannot have arbitrary complexity. So, and we'll actually see a little bit of that either today or on Wednesday, where basically, so you might have done something like that if you took a numerical analysis class, that you did spline interpolation, right, or polynomial fitting. And what you would see is that if you increase the degree of the polynomial, things would probably fit better, but at some point the polynomial would start oscillating quite crazily, and you would really not get a very good fit of your data anymore. This is what's called overfitting. And the tool to combat this is what's called regularization. So regularization is a means of constraining the complexity of the function classes to a well-controlled and sample size appropriate set. Okay. We do that in real life a lot, right? So when you're trying to figure out the solution for a problem, you're usually not going to start with the most complicated and most outlandish explanation. You're going to start with the simpler explanations first, and only as you get more evidence will you then go and add more outlandish explanations. On top of that, you also typically have a pretty good prior belief on what consists of a simple and plausible solution and what's less plausible. So let me give you an example. If a student shows up and says, the dog ate my homework, you're not going to believe, right? Because, well, dogs typically don't eat homework. Well, it's not that there has never been any dog that ate a piece of paper, but it's just a very outlandish, a very improbable and infrequent and rare case that this actually happens. So the same thing is what you want to make sure that in terms of function classes and their nice mathematical terms, I mean, I'll just show you one of them. So if I have a function f of x, which is just, the inner product between some parameter w and x, so these are all vectors. Let's say, let's say x and w are in Rn, maybe plus some b. Right. So these are basically functions which, have different slopes. Maybe that's one function. Maybe there's another one. Maybe this is a third function yet. So then I will prefer this function here over this one because this one is flatter. And now you might say, well, in one dimension that's kind of boring. As soon as you go to very high dimensional spaces, choosing a flat function is going to be usually a very good thing. So one way of measuring how complicated my function f is simply by computing the squared norm of w. Let's just take a 1/2 so the derivatives look nicely. And then maybe for good measure, I'll add plus 1/2 b squared as well. By the way, can everybody in the back still read this? Cool. Good. So the simulator is right. So this looks very contrived. However, we'll actually see this stuff a lot over the next few lectures. So for instance, you will get support vector machines and regressors and all sorts of other very nice tools through this. And this is a way of quantifying complexity that people use very much even now. So probably your friendly spam filter or ad predictor uses tools that are not too dissimilar from this. They might not use a squared norm. They might use a 1 norm. So does everybody know? Who knows what the 1 norm is? OK, good. So the 1 norm is just the sum over the absolute values. Right? So those things are very popular even in large-scale deployed systems. Now you might think, well, this looks really primitive. Yes, it is, but it's a good way of having a prior assumption on what is complicated or not. And so what was happening in black and white in this game is that basically the weight vector for the perceptron, which is just one of those linear functions here, was getting larger and larger and larger because every time I took an action that was not consistent with what the system currently thought I was actually going to do, it would just add to the weight vector. And so the weight vector would just keep on growing without bound. And so the system would then tend to do very extreme things because the function values would keep on increasing. That's what was happening behind the scenes. I did not know it at the time when I played the game, but obviously I got frustrated like everybody else. So I hope that helps a little bit explain what we're going to do. But don't worry, this will be explained more in depth. Also, thanks for asking the question. Awesome.
One more thing to point out. You mentioned it seems simple and primitive. One of the first things that you should know, we're going to teach you both simple primitive things and maybe a few more complicated ones. Try the simple primitive things first. Right? Whenever you get to some actual problem, try the simple primitive things first. They're much easier to do. Often they work pretty well, and then you can go and solve some other problem for your startup and get closer to retiring in the Bahamas.
I mean, more to the point, there are places where you would not believe that this is what's being used, but they are very, very elementary algorithms where even what we'll be discussing in the first maybe month here is rocket science by comparison to what's currently deployed. Okay. And no, I cannot tell you more details. And no, this may not be a Google. No, actually, Google has a pretty good machine learning team. But anyway, so let me give a little bit of an overview over the tools that people typically talk about when they talk about supervised learning. And this list is by no means complete. And by the way, yes, you're going to get a lecture from both Geoff and me. So this is so basically, be prepared that occasionally Geoff will add additional content, and this counts just as much as mine. And I'll probably return the favor occasionally. Yeah, that's why you get 2 lecturers. So binary classification, I guess everybody knows how that goes. I mean, you want to find, distinguish apples and oranges, and typically rather than apples and oranges, we write 1s and -1s. So given x, find y. For multi-category, well, that's very easy. You just given x, find y, which can have, k different outcomes. And don't worry, I'll explain it in more details later. But for instance, if you want to recognize handwritten digits, well, you have 10 different outcomes. Actually 11, because you also have garbage. Then regression, well, we just have real valued things. I mean, in the stock market prediction, for instance, you run into stuff like this. Sometimes you might have entire sequences. So for instance, let's say you take like an activity tracker, like Endomodo or anything like that. Well, that might actually try to infer, based on a sequence of activities, whether you're currently running, walking, sitting, or anything of that form. Mind you, your phone might actually do stuff of this form, simply for the purpose to figure out how it should respond, how it should alert you, and be prepared of this happening a lot more in the future. Then the other thing is, well, prediction. So in this case, and this is, well, probably closest to what happens with the stock market, well, you observe all the world and everything up to now. You know what the stock prices were up to now. You want to find out what's going to happen tomorrow. So this is slightly different from a regression problem. In the regression problem, let me draw the pictures. So in regression, effectively what you have is, you have all those points here. And then maybe you draw a curve like so. And you could ask the question, well, what's the function? Well, OK, this was a better example. What's the function value here? And then you look at your regressor, and you come up with some value here. Right? And then if this is reality, then this is the error that you incurred. This is some epsilon. OK. Now, if I want to do prediction, then this all of a sudden becomes time. And you just observe everything up to here. And you're going to try and predict what happens up to in the future. Let's say, this is the 9th of September. And these are your scores, and you've been a really good student, and your scores kept on improving up to here. Then I hope, of course, that this is what's going to happen, right? Rather than that. So, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, I will be able to infer quite well, OK, let's say you were on a really downward trend. Well, maybe I can predict, I can regress quite well what that score would have been. But since I don't know, and I hope, of course, you will all do really well, this is a much harder problem. And mind you, a lot of people get this wrong. There are a fair number of papers published where people confuse those two problems and then get amazingly good performance for their estimators, even though they really shouldn't. So
predicting the past turns out to be much easier than predicting the future.
OK, so here are some examples. Binary classification, well, ham and spam, that's, yeah, we all saw that. Multi-class, well, maybe you map some image to a digit. And so, for instance, in this three-dimensional space, right, this would be, partitioning of the space into, 3 different categories. And this would be, by the way, a piecewise linear decomposition. Well, we'll be looking at stuff like that. Regression, well, you can basically just, let's say you want to find out, how happy your sparrows are, depending on, I don't know, how warm it is or stuff like that. So there are plenty of problems of that form. Sequence annotations is actually a fairly challenging problem in its own right. and you can still do a very good PhD on that nowadays. So these are, for instance, genetic sequences, and you want to find out essentially, what the start and stop symbols and the coding regions and so on are. And of course, since they all relate to each other, and sometimes you can read it in more than one way, and it's not quite the equivalent of self-modifying code, but pretty close to that. So biology is sometimes very efficient at using the same sequence for multiple purposes. So there you have a lot of structure between the various annotations. So it's not just like finding that particular gene, but knowing where the other genes are tells you a lot more about where that particular gene is, and vice versa. So you want to really infer all of that jointly. For instance, if you go to a web page and you want to parse it and find out whether there are product listings and so on it, it helps you a lot if you know that the first and second and third lines are product listings to infer that the fourth and fifth line probably also are. Well, ontologies, we talked about it already a little bit before. Mind you, this is all human generated, and if you squint, you will probably already see a massive problem with DMOS, right? Okay, so this is probably a question for the first row only, and otherwise it's an eye exam. Can somebody see what the problem is? I'll read out the numbers. So this is an ontology for about 5 million sites. It has about 100,000 editors and 1 million categories. What could possibly go wrong? Any suggestions? You might overfit, possibly, but what's even worse? What's worse? Right. So who can think in terms of 1 million different categories? Correct. So I can definitely not think in terms of 1 million different categories. There's no way. My brain doesn't handle that. So what actually probably happens is that a lot of those categories are junk, because they're so finely detailed. And if you look at the fact that you have 5 million objects that you want to distribute over 1 million different categories, there are actually a lot of categories that have exactly one element in it. On top of that, the fact that there are 100,000 editors, I mean, there were 96,877 when I looked, probably by now it's over 100,000, means that almost certainly their understanding of those 1 million categories is also quite different from each other. So in other words, this is extremely noisy, which shows you two things. First of all, this is probably a bad idea to measure the classification error by how well you do at the very leaves. Secondly, this is a very nice case for, well, you really shouldn't have to do that manually, but basically use machine learning to infer all those categories automatically. So if you're interested in that kind of work, come to me and I might have a fun project for you.
So can we prevent that happening, like predict in future campaigns?
So can we prevent overfitting in this case?
Oh no, I mean this one.
Can we predict the future? Well, so the point is, if you write a paper, you absolutely must prevent this from happening here. So the question goes back to prediction, which actually just so happens to be on the next slide. So if I could prevent predicting things wrong, I would be a very rich man now, and I would basically have made many millions of dollars on the stock market. But I'm no Warren Buffett, so well, I guess that's why I'm a professor here. No, I would be doing it anyway, but the point is, it's not possible to really prevent, to work around this in terms of reality. But what can happen is that you write a paper and you do it wrong. And then you claim you're doing really well by, predicting the stock market really well for the past. Right? And I've seen too many papers that did this. So, I mean, it went to the point where in my team back at Yahoo, for getting permission to publish a paper, you had to tick a box and specifically say, I did not train on future data to predict the past, because there were a couple of cases where papers of that form were published. So this was, as a policy, instituted lab-wide. That's why I'm stressing it a lot here, because it actually, a lot of people embarrass themselves. So don't do it. Okay, unsupervised learning, and I see we are going through the slides a little bit more slowly than expected, but I just want to give you a bit of more of an idea. So given data, well, you want to ask an interesting question about the data, and that can be, does it live in a low-dimensional space? Does it, correspond to some prototypes? Maybe there is some latent structure in the entire sequence, like what I showed you before with the user who at some point starts worrying about his health. Maybe you want to find hierarchies. So there's a lot of things in this context that you can do as well. We will probably be going reasonably light on the unsupervised learning for this course. So if you care more about this, you should probably take a graphical models class in one of the next semesters. But let me just give you a very brief overview, and yes, we will cover those. Clustering, well, you can just group things together, and people are pretty good at that. Principal components. So there the idea is essentially, can we find, lower dimensional subspaces in which our data lives in? And this simple algorithm applied to natural language processing, for instance, has the nice name latent semantic indexing, which already tells you it was more or less invented or reinvented there as well. Sequence analysis, you want to find out, at which sequences interesting things happen. This is an example from biology. Here is a hierarchical grouping. This is actually done by images. This is a particularly nice paper by Adams, Garamani, and Jordan. It's called hierarchical stick breaking, the specific algorithm that they used, and they took, I don't know, 100,000 images. So that's actually a fairly tiny data set by real standards, and grouped the images, and you can really see that, at the very leaves, you see the flowers coming together, and then, I don't know, there's some sea or whatever. But basically, this is very nicely structured. Okay, so question, what do you think is on the top? And yeah, it makes no sense, actually, what's up there, but any ideas? Yep. Actually, this would be the right thing how to model it, but they made a certain modeling assumption that I think if you fix that, you would get something that's closer to this. What actually happened, and this shows that they had a small bug in their model, is they got the lawnmowers as the top category. So, it's what you should have happen is exactly what the answer was, namely one of each, but no, it didn't. Okay. Independent components. We all do that because you probably listen to me, at least I hope you do, but you may also hear some background noise. By the way, can you guys in the back hear me? Whoever cannot hear me, raise their hands, right? Now the point is basically, if it's hard for you to hear me in the back, I will use a microphone. It's not a big problem, but yeah, I'll only use it if you need to. Now what your head is doing, or you have two sensors, right? You have one ear here, another ear there, and you're basically using this to perform background noise subtraction, echo cancellation, and so on. So if you ever had a really nasty cold and at some point one of your ears clogged up, or maybe you took a plane ride after that, you would have probably noticed that it became insanely hard to hear anything. Do the following example. Put a finger into your ear, right now, into one ear, and try to still understand and listen to what I'm saying. And you'll notice it gets a lot harder, right? You can take your finger out if you want. But basically what you just did is you reduced the number of more or less of sources of signals that you got by one. And now your brain has a much harder job subtracting all the background noises from what I'm saying. And it wouldn't have really mattered very much whether you stuck your finger into the left or the right ear. It would have still gotten very hard. This problem is a specific case of independent component analysis, blind source separation. And those things are actually used in machine learning a lot. Basically, you observe something and you want to find out what the underlying hidden causes are. And of course, one of the hidden causes of all the noise in the room is Alex talking. Some of the other causes are probably a projector going off or maybe your friend talking to you or whatever. So novelty detection, that's another case. And you would care about that quite a lot, for instance, in network security, because what you want to make sure is that nobody starts hacking your computer. Now, what you can do is you can sit down and write out, a list of all the possible attacks that you've seen in the past, which works really well against all the attacks that have already been there, right? It doesn't really work terribly well against the new attack. So to detect a new attack, usually they have the property that they are different from regular network behavior. So a really good hacker will keep a very low profile and not do things that are very much out of the ordinary. And this is exactly why you want to have a novelty detector such that you can trip up somebody more easily. So quite often by now, those machine learned components are added to what otherwise people use for network security. Or for instance, if you have, some advertising system and all of a sudden, well, the money stops to flow. Well, you want to find out what's going wrong or your server center is falling over. And you want to pick this up as early as possible for early warning signs. Or another example are jet engines. So those jet engines are ridiculously expensive. So it's usually a very hard proposition to explain to somebody, yes, I need to blow up your jet engine just to know how it fails. On the other hand, it's ridiculously cheap to get a lot of usage data, usage information about jet engines, because they fly a lot. They work a long time really well. So in this case, it's very easy to get a lot of data of typical observations. And you just want to make sure that if ever something unusual happens, you detect it very quickly. So it's another example of machine learning. Okay. Let me talk a bit about problem types. So one thing is, well, you can have data that's, IID. And we'll be making that assumption actually fairly frequently. So whenever I mean IID, it means all the observations, their order doesn't matter, and they're all drawn from the same distribution. They're all drawn independently from each other. Can somebody give me an example of data that would be drawn from the same distribution where the order didn't matter, but that's actually dependent? Yep. No, the observations are not independent. So they are dependent, but they are drawn from the same distribution, and their order doesn't matter. A Markov chain would be a bit too strong, because there the order already starts mattering.
Draws from a deck of cards?
Perfect. Yes, that's exactly what it is. So if I shuffle a deck of cards, then unless I cheat, the probability of seeing a particular card at a particular position will be uniform. However, if I give you 31 cards, then you'll be able to figure out the 32nd card or 36th card correspondingly very easily. So this is, for instance, what you exploit if you do card counting in blackjack, right? You explicitly use the fact that the observations are not independent of each other. You have no control over how the casino shuffles the cards, but by having the additional information of what you observed initially, you can do a better than random job at guessing what will happen later. Okay. Now, few problem types. Induction, well, that's basically what we talked about so far. Like, at training time, you get some x and y pairs. At test time, well, the data is drawn from the same distribution, but of course, the particular observations are not available at the same time. So this is how the homework and the exams, of course, should somehow kind of go, right? Ideally, the homework and the exams will be similar, such that if you do well on the homeworks, that'll be also good preparation for the exams. I mean, yes, some constraints will have to be applied because you will have less time for the exam than for the homework. But that's, of course, the idea. Now, what if I gave you the exam questions already a few weeks beforehand, right? It would make your life so much easier. Because you could actually spend a lot of time and compare and study specifically for those questions. This is what is called transduction in machine learning, where you have all the training data and the training labels. So I'll usually call them X and Y. And also the test data, but not the labels. So the data is essentially the equivalent of your questions available at training time. So you'd expect to be able to do better. And you'd also expect the machine learning algorithm to do better. Now, the semi-supervised, well, this is essentially the case where you have, the homeworks, and then maybe, you get a lot, or maybe past exams, and then also a whole bunch of unlabeled exams without the solutions. So that's different from knowing exactly the answer, knowing exactly the question, but having more ideas of what similar questions would be like. The one thing that you obviously want to avoid is covariate shift. Covariate shift happens if the TA set the homework and the lecturer set the exam, and then they are all of a sudden very different and the students are very frustrated. This is a practical example of covariate shift. Here's another example, and I guess you'll be able to figure out the answer of what went wrong already now. So this is something I was working with, and after that point I stopped working with that startup. So some startup in some place, some country, decided to build a system to predict whether somebody, whether people had, prostate cancer. Okay, so and they came up with this very ingenious blood test, which is, of course, a lot less unpleasant than the alternatives of finding out whether you have prostate cancer. So they thought they had a winner, and they had a fair supply of sick patients with prostate cancer and their blood samples, and they were usually very willing to donate it. And then they realized that for one reason or another, they didn't really have much blood samples from healthy people. So they went out, and because this was on a university campus, they went out and got a whole bunch of, male students, obviously, to give blood, and they paid them, I don't know, probably a pizza for their blood. And well, then they came to me and said, and they did all their chemical tests that they needed to do and spent probably around $20,000, $30,000 on it. And then they came to me and said, Alex, can you build us a classifier which will distinguish the presumably healthy males from the unhealthy males? And so I asked them how they generated the data. They told me this story. And I told them, well, most likely I'd be able to do it with very, very high accuracy, and that it would be a completely useless thing to do. Okay, any ideas of why this is what happened? Okay.
The healthy college student males are very different from healthy males of the age that actually get prostate cancer.
Perfect. This is exactly what happened. So there's a massive covariate shift between the, behavioral patterns, probably, amount of drinking, partying, just amount of testosterone, for instance, in the blood for, let's say, college students in their 20s and sick old men in their 50s and 60s. So if it's very difficult from a blood sample to distinguish, to infer the age between 20 and 60 years old, then probably something is much more fundamentally wrong. And anyway, so they wasted a lot of money, then they went to a different research organization, and they happily took their money further, and at some point that startup folded. By the way, the same thing happened to DARPA, and I can tell you another time about what happened there. Basically, they sent some tanks in the forest and had a plane fly over it to take pictures. And then they drove the tanks out of the forest and took some more pictures. And it gave a perfect classifier. So that's your puzzle to figure out what happened. Anyway, so transduction, just to show this thing, basically, if I have two data sets like this, and if I have just 2 points, then I'll probably come up with, what's on the very right. But if I tell you that, these are those 2 half moons, then, you'll probably get the solution that's in the middle. Do not use this as the only validation for your algorithm. I've seen this tried and published a few times. Covariate shift we already talked about. Here's another one. Co-training and multitask. So multitask learning is basically if you're trying to solve several related tasks at the same time. And the hope is that by getting better at one task, you'll also get a little bit better at another one. So for instance, task 1 is to detect spammy web pages. Second one is to detect people's home pages. And the third one is to detect adult content. They're not quite the same tasks, but usually home pages won't have spam. And usually home pages don't have adult content unless they're of people working in the industry. So you would therefore expect that the features that you look at for those 3 tasks are kind of related, and the functions are a little bit similar. They might be sometimes anti-correlated because, for instance, people's home pages and adult content will typically be different. But yeah, that's multitask learning. Co-training is a bit different, where you, in some cases, have both sets of covariates available, and then you want to make sure that you can actually use those different sets of observations. Let's say, for instance, page viewing, or the other one is actually page content, to both inform a better classifier on either end. So that usually happens if, for instance, you team up with somebody else who's done some measurements and they're not quite the same, but they try to predict the same thing. This happens in biology, for instance, probably quite a bit. It also happens when you buy a startup, because they may have done similar things with similar data, and then you want to not just throw their data away. Okay. Interaction with the environment. This is actually quite important. So for most of the class, we'll be talking about batch problems, where you basically get the data, you do something with it, and then you deploy the system. Online, well, that's more, where you, follow the class, you look at what I'm saying or what Geoff is saying, and you're trying to become, a better machine learner, and you predict things, and you do stuff. Or maybe, predict future stocks. So this is where you don't know and where you basically need to predict the future. Active learning, and I would very much recommend that you do this, is you actually go and ask questions. Because as proven with by very nice theory, active learning gives you much better learning rates than just observing things. And this works for both statistics, and it works for humans too. So ask questions if you're not sure about something. It will help you. So then sometimes it'll help you exponentially. Now, the bandits are something where you are now starting to interact and actively essentially explore your environment, and you need to take an action. So the metaphor is that you go to a casino and you have those one-armed bandits. I mean, this is once upon a time when those bandits were actually playing sort of kind of fair. By now it's all computerized, so don't do it. But basically different bandits would have different rewards. And so the idea is you want to figure out fairly quickly which of those one-armed bandits is going to make you the most money, or where you're going to lose the least amount of money at least. And by pulling a bandit, it costs you something, you get some reward, but of course you don't get to observe what everybody else would have done. Now that sounds awfully contrived, but this is pretty much what you're going to do if you're showing ads. Because if you show up on a website and I want to show you an ad, maybe you have an inventory of maybe 100, 200 ads that might fit this particular query, and I then have to decide which of the ads I get to show you. And maybe you click on it. Well, most likely you won't, but maybe you do. But by doing so, I won't know whether you would have clicked on any other ad, right? So for instance, if you search for Kit Kat, well, I could show you the chocolates, or I could show you an ad for Android, right? Because the next Android release is going to be Kit Kat Android 4.4. So depending on whether you're more the phone buyer or more the chocolate eater, I will lose in either of those cases. Now, what's actually even more fun is and of course I don't know this beforehand, and they have a lot of ads, and I need to figure out which ones are even meaningful and which are completely scammy. It gets even more fun if you have reinforcement learning. So this is where the environment isn't just, you know, letting you do all those things, but it actually strikes back. So in other words, if I show you too many scammy ads, you will install an ad blocker and I'm done. Or you will go away. Or you will start reformulating your queries in some strange ways to work around the idiosyncrasies of the search engine. We all do this, right? Because we use keywords, right? So maybe file type, PDF, or site such and such. And this is essentially the environment, in this case me, responding to what the search engine asks me. Right? So, or if you play a game, well, if I find out that I'm playing chess against a very weak player, I might do some very tricky but risky things in order to win quickly, which would, you know, cost me the game otherwise. Okay, so this is batch. You have training data, then you build a model and you test. Online, you have that sequence. For bandits, well, you know, you pull an arm and you see what happens. And for reinforcement learning, well, you know, you just have the environment actually respond. Yeah, absolutely.
So I still can tell the difference between bandits and reinforcement.
OK. So with the bandits, basically, each time I pull the arm, the bandit will give me maybe some probabilistic reward. But the bandit is not going to change its behavior by just me pulling its arm several times. So the bandit will not learn that, OK, Alex is a real sucker for this thing, so now I'm going to screw him. At least, I mean, OK, by now they're all computerized, so it doesn't work anymore. But basically, bandits don't change as a result of my actions. Right. In general, the environment does change. So now you can already see that there is a big discrepancy between what reality does and what our models do. And the trick to some extent is to see, you know, with how simple a model you can get away with. So sometimes you can ignore some of those things, and it's good enough. And usually for a baseline, this is what you want to do. So I remember a very painful example of where we, you know, built a system to, well, you know, did some theory and so on as well, to do prediction with missing variables. And then we just went to compare against a very, very simple baseline where you just imputed the mean, and I'll explain at some point what this means. But basically, our fancy model was just a very, very tiny epsilon better than a very simple baseline, and obviously that killed the paper. What this means is, and this was bad for us at the time, but what it means for you is that in many cases, even though reality may be fairly complex, you will be able to get away with a very stark simplification for your problems. Yes? So, yes.
In both this situation, you take the action, and the environment will react. It will give you the reward, and
Yes.
you update your models.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes. But the environment will also respond. So for instance, let's say, you know, I'll go and steal $1 from you today. And then I come back tomorrow and steal another $1. And if you're just, you know, one-armed bandit, you will let me steal $1 from you every day. But since you're a human, maybe the second time you'll probably not be so happy, and the third time you'll bring a gun along and shoot me, right? So this is the environment responding in a very drastic way to my behavior. This would be what you need to worry about in reinforcement learning. OK, so I hope that maybe was a slightly drastic example of explaining that point. OK, just to wrap it up, so discriminative and generative models, just to finish our zoology. Discriminative ones, well, we try to estimate y given x directly. Generative ones, we try to model where the data came from. The latter can sometimes give you better insights and, you know, get more information about structure. So basically, discriminative would be, let's say I have, you know, circles and squares. I want to separate them. And I only care about the conditional For generative, I'll go and model those circles. Maybe these are two Gaussians, and then I infer things. So I think there is not enough time to start talking about very, very basic tools, and I'll be doing those on Wednesday. So I think this was at a fairly slow pace. Don't worry, the pace will pick up eventually, but I want to make sure that we at least have the understanding of the same tools. Okay, good. Any questions? Come downstairs. Yeah.
Recitation tomorrow?
Oh, there is no recitation tomorrow. No recitation tomorrow.
So if I could then, can you press stop? If I couldn't meet the